and welcome to Otaku no Video. Thanks as always for joining me. Today I'm here with a slightly different, layout here, and a review of Malice Doll. You want it obscure? You got it. This is a 2001 era CGI OVA. Entirely CGI. Well, except for, we'll get to that later. Written by Chiaki J, Konaka, who you may know from Serial Experiments Lain, Ghost Hound, let's see here, what else? All sorts of different stuff. This is what he made right after Serial Experiments Lain. Oh, Technolize as well. He made this right after he wrote Serial Experiments Lain and the third season of Digimon, actually. And of course, back then CGI in Japan was very cheap and plasticky, so he had this idea. Why not make an anime where the characters are all cheap and plasticky? So this is a story about android sex workers. I'm not making this up. It's set in the future, android prostitutes, basically. But the idea is, and this is part of the premise, all the humans are gone. They've all died, or something has happened to the humans. And so these androids are just sort of sitting around with nothing to do, kind of waiting to die. And the interesting thing about that is you get to see what that does to them. And I'll get to some of that plot stuff in a minute. Unfortunately, as interesting as it was, this came out the same year as Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. So the comparisons of graphics were kind of like, Final Fantasy, beautiful. Malice Doll, terrible. And the CGI in Malice is very, very cheap. This was deliberate, though. They wanted to make this look distinctive. In fact, the director said he wanted this to look like a puppet play. Very static, very simple. Now, there are some art problems with this. I mean, besides just the problem of it looking cheap, the visuals are often very dark. A lot of times there's action and it's very muddled. It's very hard to see what's going on in some of the action shots. And I think some of this is just inexperience with CGI. Some of it is maybe a bad transfer, but just in general, don't watch this for the graphics, I'll put it that way. It is set in a very striking world visually. I think Technolize owes a lot to the visual style of this world. If you're intrigued by that style, you'll see some interesting stuff here. The direction in general is rather unusual. I mean, there's a lot of unusual camera angles. There is quite a bit of attention to detail, to seeing a character's expression or non-expression, or where they are in the frame. Now, it's not Francis Ford Coppola stuff here, but it's definitely interesting, and there's definitely attention paid to a lot of those details. The characters partly in shadow, things like that, which is just awfully nice. Speaking of characters, this is where things get interesting because, and again, this is part of the premise. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but I kind of have to explain some of the premise here. At one point early on in the story, Malice has something happen to her. She wakes up and she has a human body, and she's basically human now. The problem then becomes when she starts interacting with her old dolls, the other android girls, and the issue becomes that, like, when Malice was a robot, she looked back on all of the sex she had and had no problem with it. In fact, she saw it as rather noble. This is what she was built to do, and she did it. And when she becomes human, those memories are suddenly not quite as not quite like that. I mean, she looks back on it and she's kind of embarrassed. There's just something wrong with her prostituting herself all of a sudden, and she even can't explain it to herself. But just her views on her behavior changes when she becomes human. She also gains the ability to make others biological, but every person or every creature, every robot that goes through this transformation, it degenerates. They become more and more mutated. And so, but they become biological, and they're all very intrigued by this idea, well, most of them, and you get to see what that means. What does it mean to suddenly be human? What does it mean to be biological? What are the consequences of that? It's a very different mode of being. And that's interesting. That's really interesting to see how these robots react to this. Especially because the voices, the actors do a very good job of having the robots have relatively minimal emotion And then, like, when Malice becomes human, she gets more emotion. Not, like, shrieking, crazy emotion, but appropriately. Now, I listened to the Japanese dub simply because I was afraid the English dub would be kind of porny, considering the content. I mean, there is quite a bit of sexual... not so much sexual content, although there is some of that there. Definitely, there's nudity and such. There's a lot of references to sexual content. Quick shots back to things she was involved in, things like that. And this is not pornography. This is not hentai. It is not. It is an adult story dealing with sexual themes. But point being, these characters go through change. And Konaka does an incredibly good job of writing this kind of a story. And one thing he's always been good at is pacing. This story fits perfectly into the slot. It feels like nothing's wasted. It moves from bit to bit to bit. It's slow, but it's meant to be slow. It's building aspects, it's building elements. It's showing you the relationship between this character and this character. Now, this is, again, a slow, rather surreal anime. When it gets into sort of questions of is it believable? Is the world consistent? Things like that. It's meant to be a puppet play. It's meant to be weird in certain ways. It's meant to be unsettling, very, very deliberately. And that's good. It definitely achieves that. And honestly, it's really nice to see something that is different, that is trying for an aesthetic that we don't normally get in anime. Anime tends to be bright and shiny and such. And even when it's not, even when it's Higurashi, it's still trying to be, bright and shiny. It's very rare to get something that's this avant-garde, frankly, in anime. If you don't like thoughtful, slow anime, totally fine. If I were you, I'd avoid this. There's some sexual content here. Be aware of that. There's also stuff to think about. I mean, when I got to the end of this, again, no spoilers, but when I got to the end of this and I saw the final imagery, I was entranced, frankly. And that does say quite a lot, especially for something that no one's ever heard of and is definitely different.